This is the story of George Armwood. He was accused of a crime. He was never arraigned, tried, or convicted. Instead, on October 18, 1933, a lynch mob forcibly removed him from his cell, stabbed, beat, and mutilated him. He was dragged a mile behind a truck as villagers lined the streets to watch. He was hanged, the first time, from a tree until dead. His body was dragged a mile back to the center of town, where he was hanged a second time in front of the courthouse. He was set on fire. His extinguished corpse was unceremoniously dumped in a lumber yard for his family to claim, but not before several of his teeth and bits of the noose were distributed as grim souvenirs to the large crowd in that small town. That town is Princess Anne, Maryland. In the ensuing investigation, a number of eyewitnesses were interviewed. Several people were arraigned, charged with having instigated the mob and subsequent lynching of Armwood. They were fully acquitted. Not one person was incarcerated, sat trial, or paid a fine of any kind. The George Armwood Walk of Remembrance is the culmination of a 3-week instructional module in the Richard A. Henson Honors Program's Freshman Seminar, Selves and Others, at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. The module centered generally on America's lynching past and specifically on the 1933 case of George Armwood, who is broadly considered to be the last public lynching victim in Maryland, has among its learning goals to acquaint first-year students with local history through an honest lens that encourages dialogue about Somerset County's dark past. With regard to social justice and civic engagement, the module is designed to instill in students an understanding of how past events have shaped the world in which we live today, why conversations about social justice must be ongoing and recursive, and how we each might assume responsible roles as agents for change in our communities. Finally, because of the many inconsistencies in news reports of the Armwood case, the module presents an opportunity to advance student skills in critical inquiry and ethical research by raising questions about yellow journalism and the media's persuasion and influence over public opinion, while prompting students to seek and discover the truth as a means of reaching reconciliation. A lynching is defined as the killing, especially but not exclusively by hanging, of a person or persons by an extrajudicial mob. Extrajudicial means that the individuals performing the murder have no recognized legal authority to exact justice. Scholars and activists agree that a large number of lynchings in the United States were not recorded in the sinister annals of history. A 1979 study from the Tuskegee Institute confirms more than 4,700 such American lynchings occurred in the 80-year period during which Jim Crow laws were enforced, beginning with Reconstruction and ending with the Civil Rights Acts of the later 1960s. Nearly 73% of those victims were people of color, a vast majority were black men, and a quarter of these deaths were the result of racially motivated fear and hatred following alleged crimes of a sexual nature. A similar study conducted by the Equal Justice Initiative reports that more than 4,000 blacks were lynched in southern states alone between 1877 and 1950. More than half of U.S. lynchings of African Americans were perpetrated in just 5 states. In descending order of notoriety, they are Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama. Despite the preponderance of lynchings in the United States throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was not until 1918 that Missouri Representative Leonidas Dyer introduced his anti-lynching bill to Congress. The bill classified lynching as a federal felony and as such would have enabled the government to prosecute cases and to impose prison sentences for perpetrators and fines for counties in which lynchings occurred, with the money to be given to the victims' families. It passed the House in 1922, but was blocked by filibusters in the Senate. Reintroduced in various versions over the past century, including the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act in February of 2020, as of today, no federal anti-lynching bill has been approved and signed into law by both houses of Congress. Compared to the greater than 500 victims recorded in Mississippi, we might be tempted to falsely perceive our own state as historically progressive or safer, since the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project identifies far fewer, 40, lynching cases occurred here. And while the eastern shore of Maryland represents only 7.5% of the state's population, 11 lynchings, a quarter of them, were carried out on the peninsula, with one victim each in Cecil, Kent, and Queen Anne's counties, 2 victims in Caroline and Wicomico counties, and a staggering 4 victims in Somerset County, our county. 3 of those murders took place in downtown Princess Anne. On June 8, 1894, a mob 75 men strong lynched Isaac Kemp. Kemp, a 23-year-old berry picker, had received his wages and gone with a dozen of his co-workers to a nearby store where they purchased and consumed alcohol and became rowdy. When Constable Ed Carver intervened and told them to leave the property, a scuffle ensued, and Kemp was the lead instigator of an attack on Carver, slashing him with a razor which led to his eventual death. The mob forced its way inside the Princess Anne police station, known as the Grey Eagle, and riddled Kemp's body with bullets, an estimated 50 rounds, as he lay chained to the floor of his cell. No member of the mob was identified, apprehended, or prosecuted for Kemp's death. Was it mere coincidence that exactly 3 years and 1 day after the murder of Isaac Kemp, Princess Anne was again the site of a lynching? This time, on June 9, 1897, the target was William Andrews, a black man accused of raping white Mary Kelly of Marion. A hearing had ensued, during which Andrews and Kelly provided testimony. He was remanded to police custody to await the action of the grand jury. During his trial, Andrews confessed to the assault. A guilty verdict was delivered, and William Andrews was sentenced to death by hanging. But officials were not afforded the chance to exercise that justice. As the court adjourned, a crowd had already begun to form. They seized the still handcuffed Andrews, beat and stabbed him, took him to an adjacent property, and hanged him from a walnut tree. Tragic and reprehensible in their own right, the killings of Isaac Kemp and William Andrews at the hands of lynch mobs fundamentally differ from Princess Anne's third lynching victim, in that both benefited to some degree from due process. Kemp proudly proclaimed that he'd wounded the constable and had confessed to the crime leading to Carver's death. Andrews, too, had confessed and pled guilty. He had had a full, perhaps even fair, trial. Then, 36 lynchless years passed for Princess Anne until an event transpired that was so brutally executed, so surreal in its violence, so widespread in its public attendance to evil, and so utterly unforgivable that it would become known as Maryland's last recorded public lynching, the lynching of George Armwood. 87 years ago tomorrow, at 11 o'clock in the morning on October 17, 1933, 2 State Roads Commission employees found a shocked and disoriented senior white woman, Mrs. Mary Denston, on a wooded stretch of road near Kingston, Maryland, about 10 miles southwest of Princess Anne. She was taken for medical attention, and the sheriff was summoned. Denston, whose dress was torn but who was not otherwise visibly injured, claimed that she had spent the night with her daughter and was returning on foot to her home from the nearby post office when she was assaulted by a, quote, short and strange Negro, end quote, whom police would determine without Mrs. Denston identifying him to be George Armwood, a black farm laborer residing in Pocomoke City. Here already, close examination reveals that newspaper, and one can assume radio, accounts are inconsistent and often incongruent with factual evidence. Mary Denston, wife of Somerset County farmer Harrison Denston, is variably identified as a 71, 75, and even 82-year-old. In fact, Mary E. Denston's Pocomoke City tombstone and 1951 obituary confirmed that she was born in 1859, making her 73 years old at the time of the alleged assault. Armwood is identified alternatively as a 40-year-old and as a young man in his early 20s, the latter of which is true, as Armwood was born in 1911, making him 22 or 23 at the time of the incident. Are we to believe that in the chaos surrounding the alleged crime, journalists and authorities were confused to the point of aging Denston by nearly 10 years, perhaps in the interest of garnering public sympathy for a frail and vulnerable woman in her, quote, 80s, while aging Armwood nearly 20 years, perhaps strategically, to render him more virulent, powerful, and terrifying, a sort of deranged and depraved monster? Armwood had previously appeared in court, charged 3 years prior with an assault on a 75-year-old black woman. The woman failed to appear and to testify, and so Armwood, whom contemporaries describe as cognitively deficient, was acquitted and the case was thrown out. Today, we might ask what role Armwood's prior charge played in leading authorities to assume his guilt as the only suspect of this new assault. A manhunt ensued, and within hours, Armwood was discovered hiding on the farm of his former employer, John Richardson of Pocomoke, to whom, Richardson claimed, Armwood had turned for help. Both men were taken into custody, Richardson for having aided and abetted the alleged assailant. Armwood was subsequently booked and held in a cell at the Princess Anne police station, the Grey Eagle. The subsequent chain of events, a series of misinformed and misguided decisions on the part of local and state officials, can be qualified simply as a failure of justice. In Princess Anne, rumors spread quickly of planned racial terror. The villagers demanded a victim to slake their thirst for vengeance. Was it an attempt to protect Armwood, or to deflect the rising tide of rioters that he was taken first to the jail in Salisbury, Maryland? But less than 2 years prior, in 1931, a Salisbury mob had lynched the city's second victim, Matthew Williams, and their memory was persistent. According to reports, George Armwood was held 3 minutes in Salisbury before authorities concluded his location was precarious, an invitation to the assembling crowd to incite and enact violence. And so they transferred Armwood a second time, now to Cecil County's jail. Within hours, a new crowd erupted there, formed by Lower Shore residents who had journeyed north and joined by others convinced along the way. In a third and final move to stave off the uncontrolled mob, Armwood was transferred yet again to Baltimore County. Armwood's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following day, and with inexplicable lack of caution, Somerset County Judge Robert Dewar and State's Attorney John Robbins reached consensus to return Armwood to Princess Anne by cover of darkness. They assured Governor Albert Ritchie of Armwood's safety, and the final transfer of the prisoner was completed in the early morning hours of October 17th. The unrest in Princess Anne had not considerably abated, and Ed Johnson, Maryland State Police Captain, sensed that mob violence was imminent. When he asked State's Attorney Robbins to remove Armwood from the area again, his request was denied. Governor Ritchie conferred with the state's Attorney General, William Preston Lane, and was told that to overrule Robbins' refusal would necessitate a declaration of martial law. Thus, Armwood remained in his second-story cell at the Grey Eagle. Meanwhile, Sheriff's Deputy Norman Dryden approached the commander of the local chapter of the American Legion, Edward Young, to inquire about potential backup from the Legionnaires should things devolve. And degrade things did. By evening, as Judge Dewar returned home from the office to host a dinner party, a thronging mass of people filled the town's streets. Many bore guns and wielded clubs. Not long thereafter, they charged the Grey Eagle. Despite the tear gas ejected into the mob overpowered the police and volunteer guards. They knocked the sheriff unconscious, pried the jail cell keys from Deputy Dryden, and used 2 beams as battering rams to bust in the front door. Through the commotion, George Armwood hid beneath his thin mattress, to no avail. Shortly after midnight, on Wednesday, October 18th, 1933, the mob extracted George Armwood from the Grey Eagle, dragged him by his feet down a flight of stairs, beat and stabbed him. Someone sliced off one of his ears. He was attached to a vehicle and dragged nearly 1 mile to a house neighboring Judge Dewar's home, known today as the Levin Wilson Thomas Bach House. There, he was hanged from a tree. Once dead, he was dragged again by vehicle, the return mile to the county courthouse. He was hanged a second time, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. When the immolation was complete, his corpse was cut down. Some of his teeth were extracted as grim souvenirs, and the rope used to hang him was cut into segments and distributed also as mementos. His still smoldering body was unceremoniously and disrespectfully dumped in a lumber yard overnight until the police and his family claimed him for burial the following morning. In the ensuing investigation and hearing, 42 eyewitnesses testified to what they had observed or done. 12 men were identified as having instigated the mob and subsequent lynching of Armwood. 4 sat trial in 1935. They were fully acquitted, and the case was dismissed forever. Not one person was incarcerated or paid a fine of any kind. Of the thousands of lynching victims in the United States, the identities of many are not and may never be known, lost to history. Others were carefully, almost clinically documented, sensationalized by the press. In the case of George Armwood, a fairly vast archive exists and grows through scores of newspaper articles, a well-known radio broadcast by Clarence Mitchell, at least 2 documentary short films, a 2011 panel presentation at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, vigils and walks such as ours today, and the soil sample collected from his final resting place to take its place among thousands at the National Lynching Memorial Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, we approach a clearer and more total truth. Still, questions remain that become, over time, harder to answer as surviving eyewitnesses, who were certainly young children in 1933, pass on and take their voices with them. Critical questions. Questions about Armwood's culpability and Denston's authenticity. Did he actually attack Mary Denston? Had he raped her? Newspapers from the period report that authorities secured a signed confession from Armwood while en route back to Princess Anne from Baltimore. Whether such a confession exists and whether it was signed voluntarily or under duress is not known. From our viewpoint in 2020, we might see that the Armwood case is an intersection of the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements. Yes, a lynch mob denied Armwood his right to due legal process, presumed him guilty before his innocence could be called into question, and took his life, brutally and feloniously. 2. Denston believed herself the victim of a sexual assault and spoke out about that violence. Whether her assailant was Armwood may never be confirmed, since she was deprived by the mob of the opportunity to face and identify him. What is sure is that we must not villainize Denston in her role as Armwood's accuser, but rather conclude that there were 2 victims in this story. Confronting the tragic legacy of lynchings and racial terror is a painful but potent undertaking. Raising awareness of the past creates productive conversations, encourages action to reform and efface the iniquities of our justice system, and helps to heal communities like ours in Princess Anne. From national efforts like those of the Equal Justice Initiative, NAACP, and ACLU, to state and local contributions from the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, Surge Delmarva, and the Somerset County Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, great and meaningful progress is being made to acknowledge and advance these truths, to pay tribute to and remember the victims, and to repair rifts, overt and latent, between neighbors.